Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters from Quilting is My Therapy, and I sure missed you all last week. I hope those of you that celebrate Thanksgiving had a very happy Thanksgiving, and those of you that didn't had a very good week. We are now into week 3 of the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, and I'm excited to do a live chat recap where I go into a little bit more depth into the tutorial and answer your questions live. Jessica's here in the studio. She is writing down the questions to give to me at the end, so if you have one, go ahead and type it out. And if you don't get your question answered, leave it in the comments. I'd love to get on there and answer them for you. So real quick though, a couple things. We're gonna dive into 2 different videos. We're gonna talk about quilting feathers and blocks, and we're gonna talk about quilting the feather meander and a little bit of thread painting. So a nice little assortment of designs there. So first of all, I wanna say that in the type chat, I noticed that some people were like saying, I didn't get started, I'm so behind. No worries, no stress. Okay, I know this is a busy time of the year. I know we all have real life happening, so if that's, you don't be stressed out about it. The videos will stay on my YouTube channel for you to take advantage of whenever it's convenient. And I still encourage you to join me for the live chat to, chime in with some questions or participate. So I'm here every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. Well, without any ado, let's get to the presentation, the pictures. So we're going to get into the feather stuff, but first, real quick, just want to tell you, oh, sorry, I'm trying to get my thing to work. Why is it not working? There we go. All right, first of all, if you've been considering buying a Handy Quilter long arm, I just want to let you know they're having a Cyber Week special that ends this Sunday. Some of you might not know that I'm actually a Handy Quilter dealer. I've been using Handy Quilter machines for almost 10 years. So when we opened our shop about 6 years ago, I knew I wanted to sell long arms and kind of go on that journey with others as well. So if that's something that you've thought about or you have questions about, please email us. We'd be glad to help you out with that at machines@quiltingismytherapy.com. Just want to tell you about that good deal that's coming up. But now let's get into what we actually worked on through the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge. So the week we did, the first week or the second week, was quilting feathers in blocks. And during these 2 weeks, feathers and blocks and the feather meander, we have filled in the center of our Fabulous Feathers panel. Of course, this is optional. It's not, you don't have to have the panel to participate, but you can definitely quilt along with me if you'd like. There were some questions on the YouTube channel about where do you place the thread colors? How do you do the thread in the center? So just want to take a second and talk about thread color. This is where I suggest using the threads that are in the coordinating thread collection. This is just a suggestion. If you don't want to take the time to switch out thread colors, no worries. Using one neutral color thread over the whole center will look great. So a light gray or even maybe an off-white will look awesome. But if you want to quilt it kind of like I did, you can use those thread colors that are in the collection. And I picked them out so that they would go over a range of colors and really kind of show it. So that is in the quilting diagrams. So the free downloadable quilting diagrams I have every week are linked to in the videos, and I hope you'll take advantage of those. I think they're really helpful if you're struggling with the design, because then you could practice drawing over it, kind of get the hang of the design and hopefully get more comfortable with it. And then in the diagrams, I also gave you placement suggestions of the designs. Here's the thing. This is only if you want some suggestions. I know that there are people out there that are like, don't tell me what to put in what block, and I definitely won't. You can put it wherever you want. But I do know from previous free motion challenges that some quilters really like to know where they should put things, and so if you want a little suggestion, you can help that or have that for sure. All right, let's get into the blocks themselves, or the designs that we learned. And I'm going to kind of run through them, not pretty quickly. I'm going to run through them and talk about where you might use them and give any additional pointers that maybe didn't work into the video. So the first one was the basic feather. And I know I say basic, it makes it sound kind of like boring, but it's an amazing feather. And the reason I call it basic, it's a great one to start with because there's no traveling. It's very, intuitive, quilting that half heart shape. And so it's a really nice one to start with. Now, I know from teaching quilting for so many years that sometimes the thought of putting a design within a quilt block can be a little scary, right? You're like, but actually you might find it a little easier. Having that defined area gives you one less thing to think about. And it's kind of weird to think that that would relieve just enough of that pressure, but it does. So don't let the idea that you're quilting in a defined space be scary. Look at it like kind of like a boundary, like here you go, hang out right here. The most important thing is that you just fill in the space as much as possible, right? Just make sure that the whole area is filled in, whether you put echoes or however you handle that. Now, in the beginning of the video, I think I said this, if not, I meant to. If you already have a way that you quilt one of these designs, don't change it. If it works for you, do it. I'm just showing you what works for me. So if you're already like, I already know how to quilt this feather, but I'm going to change it because that's how Angela does it, don't do that, because that might lead to, crying. So the basic feather, the way I quilt it, I like to quilt up to the top and then add my petals coming down, but you can do it any which way. Just want you to know there's some options there. So there was a question in the chat. I get on about half an hour before I go live and text chat or type chat with everybody. And there was a question like, well, how do I know where I should put these feathers, right? It's one thing to know how to quilt a design, a completely different thing to know when and where you should use it on a quilt. So the basic feather is going to be good for almost any block. I especially love it in busier fabrics that you can't really see the feather, because if I'm going to not be able to see the quilting, I'm going to do something a little quicker. But it's also going to be great. All the feathers are pretty good in blocks that are not too wide. I don't want to really try to extend that petal out, so I'm going to keep them within 6 inches or so. And I'll show you here in a little bit how you can kind of work around that. But for the most part, any shaped block that's not too wide, so especially points, diamonds are a great option, triangles, stuff like that is a really good option for that. Now, this particular quilted sample, you can see it's quilted in contrasting pink thread. This was the picture for filming. And so when I was filming, I use a different thread color so it really stands out. But in this example, you can see that it's blending in. And there was a question on the type chat beforehand. Has anybody noticed why the colors are different in the block she's quilting on? I actually already have one of the quilts already quilted, and then I'm quilting another one throughout the process of the challenge. So the first one I quilted is kind of like the sample quilt. That's all the pictures come from. And I use blending thread color, and then in the video filming, I use contrasting. But this will let you see what the design looks like when it's quilted with blending thread. It just looks nice. You have that beautiful texture, and it just really is a quick design. Another thing I love about it is that it starts and stops at the same point. So when I start that feather and when I end the feather, I'm back where I started. So if I have a lot of blocks in an arrangement, like a star or like a grouping, it's just going to make it really easy to move on to the next one. So another example of when I might do that. The next feather we talked about was the Wonky Feather. And this one is where we're making all those petals different widths and different sizes. And I had to include this because I tried to include one that is a easier variation or maybe plays into one of our natural tendencies. And a very natural tendency of new quilters is to struggle with quilting those petals so that they're all the same size, or so that they fill that area as much as we want them to. So if that's the case, let's just lean into it, right? So if you're having trouble quilting your petals, make them different widths. Let's have fun with it. But the trick here is I want it to be different enough that it looks intentional. I don't want it to look like I was trying to make them the same size, which is failing. I want to make it pretty obvious that this is a fun, funky feather. And so when we do that though, now we're going to have gaps in between our design and the edge of our blocks. And that's a normal thing with this design. So what I'm going to do is use echoing to fill them in. So after I quilt the feather, I'm going to go echo both sides and make sure there's no big gaps. The reason being, I want the feather to have the attention, not the unquilted area around it to be at attention. Where would you use this particular design? Maybe a more novelty quilt, a kid's quilt, a fun, funky quilt, maybe in a regularly shaped block. Maybe you have some weird pieced block that just does a lot of different shapes. Throwing this one in there is going to be really nice because you don't have to worry so much about making it come all the way to the edge, but definitely a lot of fun. Now the first two designs that I talked through, the basic and then the wonky, I quilted my own spine. But some of these designs, I talk about using the seam of the block as a guide, and we're going to see that here in a second. But these particular two can be quilted so that it has a straight spine that goes up the middle. But for the most part, we know I like mine a little curvy, a little wavy. I think it gives it a nice look, but it's up to you. You can quilt it either way, totally fine. And then here's that design with the blending thread color, so you can see the texture and how pretty it would look on a quilt. So again, it's that unquilted area that draws our attention. So even if your echo lines aren't perfect, even if your traveling on the spine isn't perfect, it doesn't matter, because when you step back, that unquilted area is what gets the attention, and that's going to be those big, beautiful petals that we're quilting in there. All right, then we went on to the custom feather, and this feather goes by a lot of names. I just call it the custom feather. It's definitely not one that I came up with, but it's a beautiful, elegant feather that does incorporate a little bit of traveling. So it's one more thing to think about. And if you're like, I can't think about anything else, then you can hang out with the basic feather. But the custom feather really does come together quickly once you get the hang of it. Now, I showed it in a couple of different ways. First, I showed it with a straight spine as though it was coming off of a seam. I know the panel, these aren't actual seams, but if you had a pieced block, this might be a way to highlight those different portions of the piecing, especially if there's a lot of contrast in the fabrics. So if, let's say, it's like a split triangle and one side's white, one side's black, or very contrasting, I might do that to kind of highlight the two sides. Or if it wasn't pieced very well, I might just do a wavy spine. But there are some benefits to both. So first of all, not having that echoed spine means that this design starts a little different. It starts right at the bottom and gets right into it, as opposed to quilting that spine first. My spine is already there, right? It's that piecing or that fake line in the drawing or in the design. Now, one thing I want to point out at the very left, I hope you can see it, those first petals that come out are angled a little bit. They're kind of differently shaped than the rest, and that was actually a question that came up in the type chat before we started. She said her first petal is always kind of at a weird angle. Well, that's because I'm going right from that corner and going right up to it. If I didn't want it to be that weird shape, I could have traveled up a little bit and then started it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't worry about it. The whole idea is that even if the first feather looks a little different, it'll look different on both sides and it will be fine. It's usually just to get us into the flow of quilting the design, and then we get that nice shape. As with the basic feather, I'm going to make sure this fills in the space as much as possible. But if I'm having trouble running into the edge, I want to make sure I leave that nice curve so we see the pretty petal. So I want to leave just a little bit of gap in between the design and the edge. If I'm having trouble with that, I'm going to stop short and use echoing to fill it in. I want to see that curvy side to the petal. This particular design is one I'm going to use in a block that I want to show off, right? This is going to be for a quilt that I'm super proud of, or a block that I want to highlight, maybe even be able to see it, especially like if it's tonal fabric or a solid fabric. If it's a really busy fabric, I personally am probably not going to take my time to do this because it takes a little bit longer. I might just do a more basic feather or something a little bit quicker. This is the example from the Quilted Sample, and you could tell with that blending thread color, you just have that nice texture. Then we talked about a different type of feather, the ferny feather. So this one is a little different. It's fun because you get this pointy, kind of different, whimsical look. It's just a little bit different look. The thing is, when we quilt our custom petals, we're actually quilting them in groups of two. So one will go out, and then one comes back. It's easier for me to quilt a round one out and a pointy one back, so I tend to alternate between them, but you can come up with your own arrangement if you'd like. This is perfect, I think, for quilts that maybe you want a little bit more of a masculine look. Maybe it's a nature-themed quilt, or maybe I just started accidentally quilting them kind of pointy. It just shows that you can change up that petal shape. And that was one thing I didn't really have enough time to get into a lot of. If you want to create your own variations, just changing up the shape of your petal will create some fun effects. So experiment with that and see what you can't come up with. There's some really cool ways you can do that. But for this particular example, I just liked how it changed it up a bit. Maybe it's a little bit different, again, for a little bit more masculine quilt. Now, this was a sample that I actually quilted while filming, and it has that slightly contrasting thread. When that spine, when all those lines are coming to the center of the block, it's really going to draw attention there. So again, this is going to be in a block that, if it's a pieced block, that's pieced well, because that's where we're going to be seeing those lines come to. And I want to make sure that I use a blending thread because I don't want that thread buildup to take away from that big, beautiful feather. But again, once you're done, even if it does have a little buildup, when you step back, all you see is that unquilted area of the petals. And that was one thing, again, we were chatting about. Kay was like, you always make us feel like it's going to be okay when we're done. The thing is, it's really hard to keep going when you're not happy with how it looks. You're halfway through the feather, you're like, this is not doing what I want it to do. Keep going, because once you're done and you step back, that's when you get to see the whole thing come together. And that's when you really get to see the design for itself. So sometimes it's the keep going that's difficult, but if you can just keep going, I think you'll be happy with how it turns out. All right, not pictured here, but I did show in the video how to quilt that custom feather with a wavy spine. And the main difference is I'm going to quilt my spine before I start adding my petals. But then we kind of got into a different variation, which was a curly feather or a swirly feather. And this is taking out a part of the feather that maybe I'm struggling with, and that could be traveling. Traveling is like a funny quilting joke, right? Quilt a shape, but then quilt it again right on top of itself. Doesn't that sound like fun? The trick to that is just to know that getting it close is going to be good enough. But for some of our perfectionists out there, that might be not cool. So this particular design takes out the traveling by quilting my petal and then echoing it back to the spine. So this is not going to necessarily be quilted in groups of 2 like a basic feather or a custom feather. It's going to be just quilting each one individually. It's a different look. It's a little bit more, ornate, a little bit more, I don't think it's beautiful. It has a different look. But mostly, I would suggest using this if you're struggling with that traveling, because it can just take it out. Another thing is that since these petals all go together the same basic way, even though they're different shapes, you can intermix them. So if you want to do some curls and then some ferns and then some regular ones, you can, and you can really have fun coming up with different arrangements. Here I just threw in a couple of regular petals just for fun, but you can see that extending that petal out to the edge, adding that echoing, it just gives it a different look. Now in this example, I did the wavy spine where I'm kind of ignoring the fake piecing on the panel. And this is something I might do if the block isn't pieced very well, if there's not a lot of contrast in the fabric colors, or if I just want a different look. I love a little bit of echoing in the spine. It separates it a bit, so that might be why I do it as well. Just know you have some options. Now this is the same design in a bigger block with the straight spine, and so it does give it a little different look. First of all, it has that contrasting thread because I was filming it. All the lines come into the center. It still looks really pretty. It's not my favorite. I like the more curvy spine. I think it just looks more whimsical, but just shows you that you can pick and choose the different elements to create the feather that works for you, and that's what I really want to encourage you to do. Kind of talk to yourself in a not weird way. Hey, what do I want that spine to look like? What do I struggle with on the petals? How can I make this easier for me? Because I don't want you to feel like you're being punished by having to do the quilting. Try to figure out what you can do that will make the design easier for you, and then you can kind of build off of it. So one design that did not have time to make it in the tutorial was the plume feather. I did film it, but I try to keep the tutorials 15 minutes or so. I don't want to have them too long, and so this one I just cut out. I love it. It's a beautiful texture. If you want to learn how to quilt the plume feather, it's actually been in 2 other challenges. It was in the Flora and Foliage Challenge, which was the last free motion challenge, and it was also, I think, in the very first one that we did. So you can check those out and get some tips on it. But again, it just shows how changing up that petal shape, giving it a wavy spine, and a little bit of a different top just gives it a different look. And so this is going to be great for more nature-inspired quilts, more masculine quilts, or maybe just something I want it to look like an actual feather, not just a quilted feather. But it's a really good design, and just like the basic feather, it starts and stops in the same spot. So I do love that. Now in the handouts, if you purchase the expanded PDF quilting diagrams, I talked a little bit about this. When I started doing the challenges, I started adding the free quilting diagrams, gosh, probably a few years ago, and then realizing that there's a lot of material that could be helpful to some quilters that need a little bit more help. So I started doing the expanded resource. The expanded resource and the live chats together with the video is going to be really good for you to get what we're talking about. But some of the stuff I pull out of that expanded resource and use in the live chat. So one of the things was, okay, quilting feathers and blocks, how do you handle some of those things that come up? They're not always going to be shaped blocks like this, not always going to be where you can just put that feather in. So how do you handle, for instance, blocks that are too large? Maybe you're quilting on a small throated sewing machine and you just don't feel comfortable quilting in such a big area. Or maybe it's too wide and you just know it's not going to look great. How can you still incorporate that feather in there? And the first thing you can do is use the quilting to break up the block. So in this particular example, I have that big section. I broke up into separate sections and quilted smaller feathers. Now, this isn't very difficult, right? Because obviously I designed the panel, so it's in pieces, you look like piecing, but this is something that you could do with the quilting as well, even if it's not actually pieced in the block. So look at that block and think, how can I break this up into chunks to make it a little bit easier? I'm still gonna get that beautiful feather. I'm still gonna have that nice texture, but maybe it's a little bit easier for me since I'm quilting two smaller feathers than one large one. So don't be afraid to break them up, rearrange them, and make them easy on you. Or how about those weird shaped blocks? You're like, I really want to put a feather in here, but I don't know how to do it. Break up the petals, use different sides of the feather, kind of use your imagination and think, how can I make this different? And this particular quilt was one for Tula Pink, and I thought, I love the idea of a feathered heart, and I just couldn't figure out how to make it look quite right in the center. And so I flipped it around, and I loved how it's just a little different. So don't be afraid to use your imagination and use them in different ways. There's going to be quilts that you come across and you're going to be like, I don't know what to do. Think about breaking it up or using it in a different arrangement. And then lastly, using echoing to make the block more manageable. So this is one of my favorite go-to tricks. If I have a block that's too wide, or I have one that's just, I want to knock it down a little bit, make it a little bit easier, adding a little bit of echoing. Now here on this block, I have echoing on just one side. It's like a dot-to-dot echoing, but I could echo both sides if I wanted. But just know, long story short, that you can use the quilting to make those spaces more manageable. And even in those really large star blocks, you can say to the same thing, had the echoing and then the feather. And again, just quilting one side of the feather as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can cram these into lots of different blocks if you just apply your imagination. All right, so this was the quilted sample I did during filming. So you can see that's a little bit different than the first one I showed. The first one was a sample. You might notice that this one doesn't have the echoing around the outside. In the quilting diagrams, I showed you how you can add that dot-to-dot echoing around the blocks if you want to, like I did in the first sample. If you're like, no thanks, I'm just struggling with getting the meander down, then no problem, you can definitely skip over that. So once we left the blocks behind, then we went to the feather meander. And the feather meander is definitely worth learning. Okay, so I know from the type chat before we went live that some people were like, I don't know, I'm struggling. Let's talk about it, let's break it down, but just know that this is a great way to practice a feather. Since I only have petals on one side of that spine, I can easily quilt it, maneuver my way around an area, and just know that just because I quilt my spine in a swirl doesn't mean you have to. Try it in different shapes. I just like a swirl because that's just how it works. So let's break down the shape and kind of talk through it. It's going to start with my elongated spine, and I like it to end in a curl because that's how I am. And in the video, I go into a lot of detail about leaving yourself space to work yourself back out. So once I come into the center, then I'm going to add my petals, working my way back out to where I came from. Sometimes when I've taught this, I know the struggle is knowing where to go and where to add your next one. So as you quilt your spine, if you end it in a little teardrop, that will help kind of get you on track to start adding your next ones. I will say, this was not my idea, but somebody on the Facebook challenge group posted a picture of the center of her feather and said she finally figured out when she saw that the first petal makes a yin-yang with the spine. And so I'm like, oh, that's a really good, so if that helps you, that visual, try that out. But for the most part, I'm just quilting my petals and I'm filling in the area and moving on, using echoing to get where I want to add my next one, adding my spine, and adding those petals. This is so important with an all-over meander. You have to fill in an area, fill in a whole area before you judge what you think about the design, because that's, like I said, when you get to see that beautiful texture and you get to like really appreciate what it looks like. The hardest part about this design, like any meander, is that you're going to get gaps in between your feathers, and so when that happens, we're just going to add echoes. We're just going to put something in there. Add echo, a couple of petals, quilt a swirl, put whatever you need to fill it in so that you can move on. And sometimes that right there, just knowing what to do, just keep going until the whole area is filled in. Even if that means you throw in some swirls, you throw in some echo lines, you just want to not leave any gaps. When I'm quilting any design, I like to treat it like a blob, which is not a great mental picture, but I want it to kind of build off of it, and I want to handle any gaps while I'm there. I don't want to wait and come back because I know myself and I'm going to forget. And so I want to add any echoing before I move on. So don't worry about how many petals go on your feather. Don't worry about which way they're facing. Don't even worry about how big they are. Just try to keep your petals the same size. Don't worry about your spine, which way your spine is facing, or how big your spine is. Keep your petals the same size, and that will help give it a nice overall texture. Again, I'm quilting those petals with that half-heart shape, kind of like that basic feather. But if you're struggling with that, you can quilt them more like a flower where they just kind of intersect. It's going to be fine. All right, one quick thing I want to talk about the feather meander. Hopefully this illustration helps. So when I quilt my swirl and I'm getting ready to go into my next out of my petals, sometimes it can be hard to know where do I go. If you look, I like to work my way outside of the swirl where I have more room. If I start where that little arrow starts and work my way that way, I'm going to have enough room to add my petals. And we can see here, this is what that's going to look like. Again, it's just how I do it. That's all I can say, but you can do it how you do it. Now, here's the kind of picture I took from filming, and it's in the video. So again, there's my swirl, and I want to work my way back out, outside the swirl. But sometimes we go on the wrong side. So here, what I've done is I've quilted along the inside. This is what it looks like here. I've quilted my spine, and now instead of wrapping around the outside, I'm coming on the inside. How do I know that? Because I don't have as much room as I did before. And so what happens, I get something that looks like this. Is there anything wrong with that? No. If that happens to you, don't rip it out. Don't cuss. You can have a drink of your quilting juice if that helps, but you're just going to echo and move on. Add petals to the other side or not. Add echoes or not, just keep on going. And I promise when you're done, you're not even going to notice. It's just going to kind of blend in with the rest. And so here I've added some petals on the other side just for fun, just to fill it in. So, and then keep going, keep going, keep going. And when you're done, you'll have that beautiful overall texture right here. Isn't that cool? Like if you didn't know where to look for that, you probably wouldn't notice it. And here's the thing, if you do it once, you're probably going to do it a couple more times. So now it's a design feature. It's like your very own variation. So try not to get too worried about that. Now in the video, I have you filling in the gray area with the feather meander, but this works really good as a filler using it around other elements. And so here in this orange area, we're going to see this in a future video. I have that big beautiful feather filling in that irregular space. I have all the feather meanders quilted similar in size, similar in spacing, just kind of filling it in with a nice curvy texture. And so this is going to be great as a filler if you want to quilt it smaller. That was a question that came up on the type chat. How do I quilt it smaller? Well, first, get comfortable with the design, and then you can start shrinking the space between the lines. But if you're trying to shrink it down and learn how to quilt it, that's a couple different things to think about, and that might not be very fun. So learn it first at the size that feels comfortable, and then either try making it bigger or smaller after you feel comfortable with it. The best analogy I have, I won't spend long on this, but you know, like when kids are learning how to write their letters and the teacher's showing them to write their name, you never hear a kindergartner teacher saying, make all your letters the same size. They don't care. They just want them to learn their letters. And then, once you learn your letters, then you can make them all the same size or bigger or smaller. You just have to learn the letter first. Now, if you want a different application of this design, it goes really well. It pairs very nicely with other designs. So combining it with swirls or leaves or meanders is a lot of fun. And you could even quilt it on a slightly bigger scale so that it pops out a little bit more like it does in the green area here. So by purposely filling in around it with slightly smaller designs, I'm getting the pop of feathers, and they're kind of showing up a little bit more because they're not blending into each other. So this is a great way to draw attention to an area or attention away from something else. So just know that you can really take this shape and go really crazy with it. So the feather meander, we filled in the background with that. And again, there's that echoing that I was telling you about. That's in the free quilting diagrams if you want to do some dot-to-dot echoing too. I did that in the quilted sample, but not in the one for filming. All right, then at the very end, like a little cherry on top, a little here you go, we talked about thread painting. And I just kind of nudged it in there just a little bit. Just a little teeny tiny thread painting, nothing to be nervous about, as a way to give your quilt a different effect. Now, if you're thinking, I really struggled with the feather meander, so I know I'm going to struggle quilting it again, you don't have to do it. But it is a fun, adventurous technique where we layer threads on top of each other to get this different effect. And so around the bigger blocks, the bigger kind of cross it makes, I use threads from the Coordinating Thread Collection to layer on top of the quilting just to give it that cool watercolor effect. And what I did in the videos, I talked about just travel on top of your feathers that are within an inch or two of the block, and that's going to give it that shaded look. I'm really going to make it look good. So here's the blue section. In the quilting diagrams, I do make a note, the haze is a little dark. So if you're like, I don't want to show up that much, going something with baby blue or a light blue glide is going to be really helpful to not be so dramatic. During filming, I use the haze. I love it, but I know that it can be a little scary. So there I have all of the Feather Meander quilted in the gray, and then I layered a different color on top of it. Why did I do it that way? Because that's how I do it. I like to do that because where that gray will come through, it will just kind of help blend it a little bit more. It also gives me something to kind of follow along, but you could do it your own way and do blue and then fill in around with gray. It's totally fine, just to get that different look. If the idea of doing that's like, I want to try it, but I'm a little scared, go with a very, very light color, or maybe even just the same color used in the background, but a shade or two darker. So if you did a light gray, just do like maybe a little bit darker gray on top of it, you'll still get that shaded effect. But what I really liked was the color kind of look like it's glowing behind the blocks. And what's fun is I know in the filming when I show like the pink lemonade thread, it's like, oh, that looks so dark, it looks crazy. But when you pull that thread off, that individual strand, and you put it on there, you're just going to get that lovely texture. It's an adventurous technique. The hardest part is you're not going to really know what it's going to look like until it's done. So you have to relax and just enjoy the process, which I know sounds annoying if you're learning how to do something, but it's really fun to do. And if you think you've put too much thread, it shows up too much, you can take that gray back out and put it on top of it and kind of build up with it. So I just took a couple screenshots on the long arm. Here's the Feather Meander that I had quilted nice and small, and then I changed into that pink thread and I quilted right on top of those lines. Since I was filming and you really couldn't see it, I went over it a couple times to really kind of make it stand out, but it just depends on what you're going for. And I just did it within that little section. During the video, I say things like, you don't have to quilt the whole feather, you can jump in between, and you can really kind of have fun with it. You can also quilt it all the way out, but I just like how it gave it a little bit of a shadow effect and made it a little bit more manageable for those of you that may be a little nervous about the thread painting. This is one of those techniques that you can take as far as you want. Normally, when we think of thread painting, we're thinking vivid picture designs, lots of thread. Here, we're just tiptoeing into some thread colors to give it a different effect. So we're kind of doing the thread painting light. But if you're up for it, it's a lot of fun. So if you have any questions about that, you'll have to leave it in the comments because I'd love to hear what you think about it. All right, speaking of questions, that finishes up the pictures, and I saw Jessica over there writing like crazy, so I'm sure she's got some questions for me. Thank you. All right, first question. On the dot-to-dot section, how did I get it looking puffy? The unquilted area just kind of pops off of there, and that's really the benefit of side lighting. So that's more of the photography there. I did use 2 layers of batting in that quilt, so it's going to stand out a little bit more, but also having a side light to cast a shadow is what's going to make it look the puffiest. So that's pretty much the magic of lighting. All right, what color thread am I using in the bobbin when using the dark blue backing fabric? So I'm using, so I would suggest using the same thread color on the top and bottom, or I like to use pre-wound bobbins. I like to use the light gray pre-wounds, and so that's what I use, light gray. Even if it shows up a little bit on the blue backing, the backing's pretty busy. I don't think you're gonna see the quilting very much, and I did that on purpose. I know some people are scared about that. So use light gray or use the color that you're using in the top. Either one's gonna be fine. Since it's a busy fabric, it's not gonna show up. And I will tell you, this is something I say a lot, thread color is totally subjective. So if right now you're freaking out because you're like, that's not what I did, it doesn't matter. You can use different types of thread, different colors of thread, different weights of thread in the top and bottom. Just find what works for you. However, if you want a suggestion, light gray in the back is great. Will I go over how to quilt the pillow panel? Yes, I will. I actually have filmed some videos for that. I just haven't had a chance to get them edited. So we're going to talk about maybe in like a bonus video how to pull out one design and put it in all the blocks of the pillow panel. So we'll definitely see that. It's on the to-do list. When do I use ruler work around the block? So in one of the videos or the live chats where I talked about stitching in the ditch, I said, or maybe it was in the video, on a sewing machine, I don't use a ruler as much as I do on a long arm, because long arm, it's a lot more difficult to get those long lines. But if I'm doing something like dot-to-dot echoing, where in this kind of longer, it needs to look kind of right, then I'm going to use a ruler for that. So for longer lines in more visible areas on a sewing machine, I'll use a ruler. For any lines diagonal at all on a long arm, any length, I'll use a ruler because it's too hard to sustain that. So the trick is do what feels comfortable to you. So if you don't like using the ruler but you want that straight line, you can pull out your walking foot and do that. I just love the dot-to-dot echoing to help separate the filler from the blocks. And you know, when I quilt the sample for the challenge, I kind of like use my imagination and go all out with it. So that's when I use that. And what is my favorite batting? I like Quilter's Dream is the brand. Poly Select is the type, so polyester, and Select is the loft. So I like polyester batting. It's not polyester like you might be thinking, like spongy see-through. It's really nice, has a beautiful drape, and it resists creasing. But honestly, any quality batting will do the trick. So if you want something cuddly, something a little bit warmer, something that kind of hugs you a little bit more, then you can go with a natural fiber batting. If you want something that's going to resist creasing because you want to do some thread painting and hang it up, then maybe polyester. But the most important thing is that it's quality batting, because I have some earlier quilts that I quilted with I won't even name it, but that stuff that's like really rough feeling and you can see through it. I quilted a bunch of quilts. Well, now they're bearding, and so strands of the batting are coming out through the quilt, which is actually, I'll sit on the couch, watch TV, and pull them out. So eventually I'm going to have a battingless quilt. So a good quality batting will not do that. So it's, again, up to you. So you have to kind of find what you like there. So again, I just want to reiterate, I know this is a busy time of year. We have a lot going on. I know that not everybody can participate at the same time. But I want to encourage you, sometimes taking a moment for yourself and sitting at the machine and having that moment of just, it's a lot of fun. I think it might help you keep your sanity through the busy holiday season. Next week, I'm going to be back with feather motifs, a very fancy sounding name for a design that's actually pretty basic in how it goes together. So we'll learn how to quilt those on our panels. We'll see how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a long arm, and then I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail during the live chat with different variations that you can make. And there's some really fun ways that you can quilt that motifs with different shapes. So looking forward to that. I hope until then you all have a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday with the next video in the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.